On this day in history, April 10, 1972, the United States and the Soviet Union signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I, a landmark agreement aimed at reducing the number of nuclear weapons in their respective arsenals. The signing of SALT I was the result of years of diplomatic negotiations and represented a critical step towards easing tensions between the two superpowers during the Cold War. The events leading up to the signing of SALT I can be traced back to the late 1960s, when the United States and the Soviet Union began engaging in talks on arms control. In 1969, President Richard Nixon and Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev initiated negotiations on limiting the arms race, recognizing the need to avoid a costly and dangerous nuclear arms race. These negotiations culminated in May 1971 with the signing of the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks (SALT) agreement, which laid the groundwork for SALT I. The formal negotiations for SALT I began in November 1971, with both sides engaging in intense discussions on various aspects of arms control, including limiting the number of strategic ballistic missiles, anti-ballistic missile systems, and underground nuclear testing. The talks were complex and contentious, with both sides seeking to protect their respective national interests while also striving for a mutually beneficial outcome. After months of negotiations, on May 26, 1972, President Nixon and General Secretary Brezhnev signed the One-Shilling Agreement in Moscow. The treaty consisted of two main parts: the Anti-Ballistic Missile (ABM) Treaty and the Interim Agreement on the Limitation of Strategic Offensive Arms. The ABM Treaty limited the deployment of anti-ballistic missile systems, while the Interim Agreement placed limits on the number of strategic ballistic missiles that each side could possess. The signing of SALT I was met with global acclaim as it was seen as a significant step towards reducing the arms race and promoting global stability. Many countries, including U.S. allies in Europe, welcomed the treaty as a positive development in the effort to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. However, the treaty was not without its critics. Some conservatives in the United States argued that it did not go far enough in addressing the Soviet threat and that it would leave the U.S. at a strategic disadvantage. Nevertheless, the treaty was ratified by the U.S. Senate in August 1972, demonstrating a broad consensus for arms control among U.S. policymakers. In the years following the signing of SALT I, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union took steps to implement the treaty. They engaged in regular consultations and inspections to ensure compliance, and the treaty was seen as a positive step in improving U.S.-Soviet relations. However, the positive momentum of SALT I was ultimately challenged by geopolitical developments. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, leading to increased tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The subsequent deterioration of relations between the two countries led to a freeze in further arms control negotiations and an eventual breakdown of SALT I. Despite its eventual demise, SALT I remains a significant milestone in arms control history. It demonstrated that diplomacy and negotiations could be effective in addressing the dangers of nuclear weapons and reducing the risk of an all-out nuclear war. It also set the stage for future arms control talks between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, leading to the signing of the follow-up treaty, SALT II, in 1979. Although it was never ratified, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty had several significant long-term implications. First, it established a precedent for arms control diplomacy between the two superpowers, showing that negotiation and dialogue were possible despite ideological differences. Second, it contributed to the stabilization of the strategic balance between the United States and the Soviet Union by capping the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-launched ballistic missiles each country could deploy. Third, SALT I included confidence-building measures such as data exchanges and verification procedures that promoted transparency and trust between the two countries. Fourth, SALT I had a broader impact on global geopolitics, setting the stage for future arms control negotiations and influencing subsequent agreements like SALT II and the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Finally, while facing criticisms and limitations, SALT I is considered a significant milestone in arms control efforts during the Cold War era, with its legacy continuing to shape international relations and arms control efforts today.